Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is February 4, 2022. Got a little bit of a COVID update for you. Not a huge one compared to some of the past COVID updates that we've done, but did want to check in with it. I've been covering COVID a lot. I think it's a really important topic. Not only is the death count just continuing to rise in the United States day after day, and I don't just mean rise like cumulatively. Actually, the number of people dying per day is still going up as of 2 days ago. So, this is actually an increasing problem. But even if you don't die during the acute phase of a COVID infection, the first 3 weeks, even if you don't die then, there is the whole question of long COVID, which we have covered on the channel before. In case you're not familiar with the long COVID phenomenon, basically, anywhere from 2 months after infection, all the way out to 8 months and even longer after the initial acute phase of the COVID infection, which of course, that's where your lungs are most likely to shut down, drown in your own fluid, pneumonia, that kind of stuff. But even after that, even if you have an asymptomatic acute phase, you can get long COVID. Actually, there's no real relationship between the intensity of the initial symptoms at onset and then your likelihood of getting long COVID later. So you could be asymptomatic up front and then get pretty severe long COVID later on. This includes a range of issues, brain fog, read brain damage. The spike proteins can cross the blood-brain barrier, create inflammation in your brain and nervous system. So this results in experiences such as brain fog, mental cloudiness, inability to focus, inability to concentrate, fatigue, nerve pain. In other areas, in children, for example, there is an increased likelihood of developing either type 1 or type 2 diabetes. That's pretty serious. Why is that? Because it seems that COVID causes direct damage to the pancreas via inflammation and related processes. Also, we did a study on the channel about the immune system. So COVID seems to cause immune disruptions in terms of missing naive T and B cells, kind of the basis of your immune system, in people up to 8 months out from the initial infection. So that's a pretty severe immune disruption. Could this be resulting in additional secondary infections, things that the body can't fight off because the immune system is still hamstrung by COVID, like up to a year after the infection? And also, will we see some kind of increase in, for example, cancer cases later on because, again, the immune system is somewhat compromised by the COVID infection? These are things that we're just beginning to learn about now because this is a novel virus. It has a lot of similarities to the first SARS from like 2003, 2004, but also significant differences. And we just don't know all the effects yet. So the whole idea of just letting Omicron rip and, everybody's going to get it because the government doesn't feel like lifting a finger, because this is capitalism and the government is controlled by capitalists and their concern is quarterly profits and they value those profits over human life. That's why we're getting over 3,500 people a day dying of COVID. How many other, hundreds of thousands getting long COVID? And it's just really not on the news very much anymore. The amount of downplaying of Omicron is phenomenal. So anyway, here's the case curve. It is coming down. However, note that although the 7-day average has been steadily dropping, it's still at like 400,000 cases a day. That's 400,000 new cases a day. In other words, that's 1 million new cases every 2.5 days. So like I said, the deaths, the average is still going up. It looks like it might be starting to plateau now, but it's, about as high as it's been at any time during this pandemic. Last winter's death toll was a little bit higher, but it's not really far behind. So tell me again how mild Omicron is. That's just a blatant lie. Also, I just want to point out on the case count, if we look at the number of new tests being done per day, the number of new tests is dropping. The blue curve there is test positivity. That's the percentage of tests coming back positive. That has also dropped, although it's nowhere near a good situation. I mean, just a month ago, it was at almost 25%, 24.5%. So for every 4 tests being done, 1 was positive. That's incredibly high. Just to put that in perspective, when the initial shutdown went into effect in March and April 2020, the World Health Organization's guidelines were, before reopening, that a state or country should have 5% test positivity or lower for 2 weeks before reopening. And meanwhile, the U.S. is just letting this rip with, 15, 20, 25% test positivity. Some of the U.S. states were running as high as 80% test positivity without shutdowns. And that's now. That's Omicron. That's under Biden. That's, restoring dignity and honor to the United States. This is the good guy. And let me just say about the entire Democrat-Republican thing, if you're totally new to the channel, we're socialists. Both parties are completely controlled by big capitalists. Neither one of them is a workers' party. That's the kind of thing that we need to build and support if we actually ever want to see socialism, not just for electoral victories, but just to get people organized for various kinds of class struggle, which in some cases can include electoral struggles, but not necessarily and definitely not primarily. Anyway, the point is, with regard to the Democrats, it's theater as far as their conflict with the Republicans. Why do I say this? Because the Democrats will go on all day and night about democracy's in danger and the Republicans are doing this and that. And yeah, don't get me wrong, politics in the United States have gone extremely far right over the last 40 or 50 years, the period of neoliberalism. Okay, great. Yeah, I agree. However, the Democrats could shatter into tiny pieces the Republican Party simply by adopting popular policy. It's all out there, but what we know from the Princeton study on democracy is that there is no relationship between public opinion and public policy. Why? Because this is capitalism. The capitalists control the politics and public policy. So have the politics gone so far right that we are now on the edge of a fascist coup d'etat? Yeah. But why is that? It's because both parties have been in on the neoliberal consensus. That's a class project by the capitalist class to roll back all of the reforms of the social democratic era from the New Deal up to the 70s, when neoliberalism really began in earnest in the late 70s, and especially with the Ronald Reagan presidency in the 80s. So okay, no argument there. Definitely, neoliberalism is fascism in slow motion. Neoliberalism is fascism on the installment plan. Yes, there has been a steady creep to the right for over 4 decades, but the Democrats aren't fighting it, although they want you to believe that they are. Because again, they could reduce the Republican Party to a merely regional party. They might control some governorships and some state legislatures, and maybe even elect a few senators and congresspeople from the most backward states, the former Confederacy and things like that. But the Democrats could utterly wipe them out and clear the road for a struggle between the Democrats and the left, which would actually result in some actual progress, merely by adopting popular policies. They know it. That's why they promise to do these things all the time. They know that they're popular. They won't do it. And therefore, they're keeping the Republicans alive. Like I said, they could send them into the dustbin of history. They could break them into tiny, tiny pieces and turn them into just a regional party, which eventually would become totally obsolete. They won't. The Democrats are who are keeping the Republicans alive. Biden's COVID response, just another case in point. All right, so anyway, back to the tests. The test positivity is dropping, but so are the overall number of tests. So if we go back to the case count, we only get new cases reported when tests are done at some kind of a healthcare facility that actually reports their data. If you do a home test, rapid test, that doesn't get reported. So in other words, while I do think that it is probably the reality that the overall case count is dropping, Omicron came on very hard and fast. Now people do have some of that natural immunity, although I have heard cases of people getting Omicron twice in 30 days, or actually I don't know if it's Omicron specifically, but that they got COVID twice in 30 days. Like they tested positive, they went through the whole thing, and then they got a new infection, tested positive again 30 days later. So, generally that natural immunity is going to last about 5 or 6 months, which is incidentally when we see, another major crest of the COVID curve tend to pop up. But, things may be different between Delta and Omicron, or just even Omicron itself. This is emerging, we're collecting data and studying it as quickly as the situation is unfolding. It's moving very quickly. So anyway, while it is likely that the overall picture on that graph is roughly accurate in terms of the shape, and that the cases are dropping, they may not be dropping quite as much as it looks due to the lowered number of tests. In other words, the test positivity is dropping, which means that more people getting tests actually don't have it. Okay, I mean, that's good. But even accounting for that, if we did more tests, yes, it's likely that some of the additional tests would also be negative, but it would probably bring that case count up because it's very unlikely that all of the additional tests would be negative. But even if we tested everyone every day, would it change the overall shape a ton? Probably not overwhelmingly, but just keep that in mind when we're trying to, look at that case count and say, how accurate is this and what are identifiable factors that might be distorting it? The other major question that nobody really knows yet is, where is this going to plateau? In other words, there was a clear peak around New Year's and it's been dropping, but where is it going to level off? We don't know, because remember, it has been dropping, but even at where it's dropped to, 400,000 average cases a day, that's still way above last year's average, which was around 225, 250,000. So we're still well in excess of that. We just don't know. For all we know, it could start leveling off next week, at 250,000. We don't know. I hope that it passes, but let's keep in mind, even if it does, when does the next wave happen? As I mentioned, natural immunity wears off, and you can get another infection at that point. Also, every time that a new variant comes into play, that really changes things. You can see that the Delta curve was really significant. It was almost as big as last winter's curve on its own. And then Omicron came in and just completely raised the ceiling on everything. So what comes after Omicron? We don't know. However, the conditions right now are ideal for new variants to emerge. When do new variants emerge? Well, they emerge through mutations. When do mutations happen? During replication. So where does replication happen? When people get COVID. So in other words, after transmission, it spreads. And then, somebody getting sick with COVID is the result of that virus replicating in their body. The virus attaches to a receptor on the cell. It gains access to the cell and it tricks the cell into making virus instead of the other stuff that the cell should be producing. Along the way, mutations happen, and sometimes they confer advantage to the virus. So actually, on that note, let's start with the first article. This is a Medium article by Xin-Jie Yang. The title is A Lab Sped Up Coronavirus Evolution to Find What Mutation Might Emerge and a Potential Drug. A 50-fold more infectious SARS coronavirus 2 is possible if the Q498R mutation arises, which is now present in the Omicron variant. This was originally written 1 year ago today, February 4, 2021, and it was updated at the end of November as Omicron was emerging, and that was when it was updated to say that that Q498R mutation actually was found in Omicron. It's one of the reasons why Omicron is so much more transmissible. So starting the article, the coronavirus, or SARS coronavirus 2, COVID-19, is actively evolving as it spreads among us. With the recent advent of multiple strains, i.e. variants or mutants, with slightly different viral properties, SARS coronavirus 2 has become even better at surviving amidst humans. This is thanks to the 3 mutations arriving sequentially. 1, the D614g mutation, which is a change of amino acid at position 614 from D to G. The D stands for aspartate, I believe, and the G for glycine. Dominated the globe last year. D614G helps the virus to infect cells more easily and become more contagious, at least in animals. 2, the more recent N501Y mutation is found in the UK, South Africa, and Brazil SARS coronavirus 2 mutants. This mutation helps COVID-19 to bind and infect human cells more easily. Third, the most current E484K mutation is present in South Africa, Brazil, and more recently the UK. It helps the virus to evade human antibodies, which contributes to vaccine resistance. The vaccines are still effective, but just less so. And then finally, they were posing Q498R as a possibility, which in fact did arise. Now, what's interesting, I'm just pausing for a moment, is there's a study that they cover in this article out of Israel. I'm just going to paraphrase. Basically, what they did was they took yeast. So there's a yeast surface display method that is used to study this kind of thing. Basically, what they did was they got the yeast to express the coronavirus spike protein, which is called the receptor binding domain. In other words, it's the domain or place on the virus where it binds to a receptor in a human cell. So it's known as the RBD, receptor binding domain. So in other words, instead of working with the actual virus, they just got yeast that had the spike protein on them to do this instead, and they studied those. So from there, they mimicked a natural selection, natural evolution process by keeping the yeast that bound to the receptors. In human cells, coronavirus binds to the ACE2 receptors. We covered this before. ACE2 receptors are part of an important hormone system in your body that helps to regulate your blood pressure. And for whatever reason, COVID just likes to attach there. That's where its spike proteins hook into your cell and start to make the connection. So anyway, they took the yeast that were more effective at doing this and discarded the ones that were less effective at doing it. And what they found in this process was, quote, that the N501Y and E484K mutations emerged independently in their screening, showing that their lab settings successfully emulated natural evolution, leading to the actual real-life scenario we're witnessing now. Quote, it is expected that in vitro or lab dish selection follows affinity gain. Affinity is the odds of molecules attracting each other. In the case of a virus, it's, how successfully can it attach to the cell, for example, and gain, obviously, that they gained affinity. But it is surprising to see that natural COVID-19 selection follows the exact same path. That's quoting the study authors. So basically what they're saying is, we figured that in running this study, we were going to see mutations that would, increase the binding capacity, that affinity gain. What they weren't expecting was that they would get the exact same mutations which occurred out in the wild. Interesting. So continuing the article, it says, after a few more rounds of evolution, something dangerous emerged. The Q498R mutation alongside N501Y and E484K increases the RBD's binding capacity to the ACE2 receptor by 50-fold. Quote, the synergism of, that's combined effects from multiple things, of Q498R with N501Y and E484K increases ACE2 binding by about 50-fold relative to wild-type COVID, stated the authors. So remember, again, this actually did happen, that Q498R mutation, and it's found in Omicron, which, as we know, is causing many, many, many more cases than before. Just recall the charts I was showing a few minutes ago. So the interesting thing here is that, surprisingly, the researchers also found an RBD with a 600-fold greater binding capacity to the ACE2 receptor. But this RBD has 9 mutations in the virus's spike protein. Then they list them all there. It's I358F, V445K. You can read the list on the screen. So they're saying that it's unlikely that COVID would get all 9 of those, sort of on its slot machine as the various mutations rack up, but it's possible. At this point, when this article was first written, Q498R was still like a hypothetical. Then it happened. So I don't know, how many times do you want to pull the arm of the slot machine? How many times do you want to roll the dice hoping that these mutations don't emerge simultaneously? Because even if it does just once, it might be enough for that to take over, and then we're dealing with something which is infinitely more transmissible even than Omicron. So there's a note in this article that just because receptor binding increases, it doesn't necessarily mean that the virus is going to be more successful. It actually could become overly rigid at a certain point, and that could actually wind up somehow working against the virus. Or not. We just don't know. And again, do you want to play Russian roulette with the virus like this? I don't. I mean, because that's one case with, 9 mutations, and that helps the virus to latch on, 600-fold more effectively. Maybe 2 more mutations would help it do so 300 times more effectively. And maybe that's enough where it makes Omicron, look mild, actually mild, in comparison to whatever would emerge from that. We don't know. But how do you stop the mutations? Well, you stop the replication. How do you stop replication? Stop transmission. We have to actually shut down transmission, because if you just let it rip, you are just feeding extra quarters into that slot machine. It's all you're doing. This whole, herd immunity, natural immunity approach, it doesn't fucking work. Because why? Natural immunity wanes. Okay? It's just, you're going to go through this again every 4 to 7 months, because that's how long the natural immunity lasts. And so you get another big spike then 2 or 3 times a year. And on it will go indefinitely. And then again, with enough mutations, you could wind up dealing with, well, we're already dealing with a significantly different virus. I mean, that's true in terms of where different strains are more detectable. Some are more detectable in the mouth, some in the nose, etc. So already, I mean, the different variants of COVID that we've known, the original type, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and Omicron, they all have some significant differences. But the more it mutates, I mean, on it goes. Actually, our next article is about Omicron's durability. That's one of its significant features in, the current incarnation of COVID. But anyway, the closing note from this article is that they think that they might be able to take the greatly increased ACE2 receptor binding capacity and actually turn it possibly into an ACE2 blocking drug. So that could actually help to shut down a COVID-19 infection. If you had a drug which basically duplicated what that spike protein outside the virus is doing, and you used it to basically lock all the doors of your cells by plugging up the ACE2 receptors, then you could stop COVID from replicating in your body because it can't gain access to the cells, and then your immune system could deal with it much more easily. So they say that actually they're working on that now. There are some other substances. I mean, there are ACE2 receptor blocking drugs. As I mentioned, ACE2 receptors are part of, it's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It involves your kidneys and other organs, the hormone system, which helps to regulate your blood pressure. Using ACE2 receptor blockers has the effect of lowering your blood pressure. They say that from their trials using ACE2 receptor blockers, it could be very effective against COVID-19, basically denying them access to your cells while otherwise allowing most of your regular body function to go on unimpaired. So, that's the good news, is this might result in some antiviral drugs. Again, the biggest risk right now is letting it rip. The more it replicates, the more it can mutate, and then we might wind up with something completely different if it mutates enough. All right, so that's that first article. The second article is by David Walsh from Reuters, updated about last week, January 25. The title is Omicron Survives Much Longer on Plastic and Skin Than Earlier COVID Variants, New Study Finds. Caption there is, Omicron can last up to 8 days on plastic surfaces and 21 hours on skin. So in other words, we were just talking about one factor in transmissibility, which is the ability of the virus to gain access to the cell by binding with the ACE2 receptor. So if a virus can do that more effectively, presumably smaller amounts of the virus would be able to create similar effects because they're more effective at gaining access to the cell, etc. Well, here's another factor, which is how long can the virus survive outside the body? So I say survive. Viruses actually are not really alive, strictly speaking. There are a number of functions which are considered typical of life, such as consuming, excreting, secreting, reproducing, etc. Viruses don't really do a lot of these things. What they are is genetic material, either RNA or DNA, encapsulated in some kind of a protein coat, and they sort of just drift around looking for a cell to infect, at which point it tricks the cell into making copies of the virus, and then more copies of the virus exist. However, outside of this, it's kind of inanimate. It's organic. It contains genetic material, but it's kind of just this thing. It doesn't really have a life of its own. It just gets produced, and then it hangs around, and maybe something copies it, maybe not, in which case, eventually, subjected to environmental pressures and environmental forces, it degrades to the point where it's no longer functional in terms of being able to infect a cell and have usable copies produced from it. So they're not really alive, but there is a question in terms of, are they viable? Are they intact in terms of, is the virus whole enough to cause an infection? And Omicron can survive on plastic for 8 days before it starts to degrade to the point where it's no longer capable of causing infection, and on skin for almost a whole day. So let's read the article. The Omicron COVID-19 variant can survive longer than earlier strains of the virus on plastic surfaces and human skin, new research by Japanese scientists has found. The study by a team from the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine, which is not yet peer-reviewed, found that the variants survived much longer than the original strain following a series of laboratory tests. They concluded that Omicron's high environmental stability, its ability to remain infectious, in particular, might have helped it to replace Delta as the dominant variant and spread more rapidly. Quote, our study showed that on plastic and skin surfaces, Alpha, Beta, Delta, and Omicron variants exhibited more than twofold longer survival times than those of the Wuhan strain, I would add, and the Gamma strain, which was closer to the Wuhan strain, and maintained infectivity for more than 16 hours on the skin surfaces, unquote. On plastic surfaces, average survival times of the original strain and the Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta variants were 56 hours, 191.3 hours, 156.6 hours, 59.3 hours, and 114 hours, respectively. So commenting there, they mentioned that this was a preprint. It was not yet peer-reviewed. However, I did read the study personally. It was a very straightforward study. Basically what they did was they got samples of the virus from the Japanese national, biological laboratories that keep samples of these things. They got some cells that are available in biology supply places that you can use to culture things, and they basically brewed up some virus, culturing it with these cells. Then they took it and they put some of the virus on polystyrene plates, I believe it was, for the plastic, and then on squares of cadaver skin. So this was an ex vivo study, not in a living organism, not on living skin, but on previously living skin. And then they just studied how long it would be around. So something to note about the using cadaver skin versus living skin is your living skin has a microbiome. There are microorganisms that live on your skin, in your mouth, in your nose, in your gut, really everywhere in your body. There are more non-human cells in your body than human ones. So that kind of immune system, microbial immune system, may interact with the virus in some way, but basically, on dead skin at least, Omicron stayed for 21 hours. The only real limitation that I saw in this study was one that they noted themselves in the study, which is that they just kind of put the virus there, whereas in reality, so COVID is airborne. It can travel via aerosol particles, but in terms of droplets or things like that, the virus might also be encased in saliva or mucus or some other bodily fluid, and the dried mucus might possibly affect how long the virus is viable for. So it might actually protect it. That's basically the purpose of mucus in your body, is to kind of like gather things up and sweep them away, more or less, or to form a protective coat. So dried mucus around the virus, I could see that potentially. We don't know yet because it wasn't studied here, that could potentially add to the sort of shelf life out in the world of Omicron. But, this study sort of assumed just sort of naked raw virus, and in an aerosolized situation, that might actually be what you get. So I don't see that as being a huge limitation, and I would expect this study to pass peer review without any kind of major revisions. So anyway, noting that, continuing, that compared the different time spans compared to 193.5 hours, the equivalent of 8 days for Omicron. The researchers reported on bioRxiv ahead of peer review. So I would just note that the alpha strain had a very similar survival time, 191.3 hours. It was only like 2.5 hours less. However, most of the others had much shorter survival times, including Delta at 114 hours. That's over 3 days shorter. So, I mean, even having 5 days survival time is a lot, but, it is significantly shorter. Anyway, on to the next section. Omicron lasts for over 21 hours on skin. On skin samples from cadavers, average virus survival times were 8.6 hours for the original version, 19.6 hours for alpha, 19.1 hours for beta, 11 hours for gamma, 16.8 hours for delta, and 21.1 hours for Omicron. Quote, the study showed that Omicron variant has the highest environmental stability among variants of concern, which suggests that this high stability might also be one of the factors that have allowed the Omicron variant to replace the Delta variant and spread rapidly. So, commenting, looking at those survival times, the original and the gamma are much lower. I would say that though 19.6 hours for alpha, 19.1 for beta, and 16.8 hours for delta are all kind of in the same ballpark. I mean, we're talking about 4.5 hours difference, 4.5 hours difference between the lowest Delta and Omicron. So, I mean, if you think about this in practical terms, even the lowest, the original Wuhan strain, 8.6 hours. So if you work, let's say, 8 hours a day outside the house, and you have, another half an hour involved in your commute. I know that this is kind of lowballing it, but bear with me. Just in practical terms, let's say at the beginning of your commute, or right when you get into work, or, as you're going on the train on your way into work, you come into contact with Omicron. It doesn't get in your body yet, but it's on the back of your hand. What are the odds that the back of your hand is going to wind up in contact with your mouth, nose, or eyes before 8.5 hours go by? I would say pretty good. Then the question just becomes, are you washing your hands or using sanitizer prior to the end of that 8.6 hours? So the point being, while you're out at work, that 8.6 hours, if you really touch anything that has even the original strain of COVID, let alone something else that can last 19 or 20 hours, yeah, I would say that there is a very high chance that that's going to wind up in your body. Really, the only kind of scenario where that wouldn't be the case is, if it became non-viable within like 20 minutes or something, in which case it lands on whatever surface it lands on. There's a few minutes there, it lands on your hand, and then, maybe there's a few more minutes there, although really people touch their face multiple times per minute. That's kind of the only scenario where, the virus almost immediately dies out in the open, and it would basically have to go directly from person to person. That's where this wouldn't be an issue. But, if it's 8.6 hours, it might as well be 49 hours, honestly. So anyway, in any case, Omicron, about 21 hours. That's a long time. Continuing, the researchers concluded that it is highly recommended that current infection control hand hygiene practices use disinfectants as proposed by the World Health Organization. So on that note, something that they did in the study wasn't really summarized in detail in this write-up. I'll read the one little sentence that they did write about it. Although the variants were generally more resistant to ethanol, that would be drinking alcohol, than the original strain of COVID-19, all of them were completely inactivated on skin after 15 seconds of exposure to alcohol-based hand sanitizers. Actually, I would have appreciated more of a write-up on that, because you can see it in the study. They basically tested different concentrations and types of alcohol on the different strains of COVID, They only tested 70% strength isopropyl alcohol. Nothing weaker. That's rubbing alcohol. And basically the 70% isopropyl alcohol knocked out completely every strain in contact for 15 seconds, which is good. That's a short amount of time. I think I had read previously that somebody thought they needed 30 seconds of contact. 15 is a lot more practicable, so that's very good news. I mean, I would like to know if weaker concentrations of rubbing alcohol are also effective. Unfortunately, that was the only one that they tested in that study. However, the good news was that the ethanol was really effective, again at the 15 seconds time mark, at even really low concentrations, like 35%. You can double check the study if you want to see that, but I was impressed. I was like, well, you need 70% rubbing alcohol, but apparently, basically 80 proof vodka would do it too. That's good to know. So, I mean, in terms of looking for a hand sanitizer, personally, I'll be looking for an ethanol-based one from now on. However, there is still the question of the plastic surfaces. So basically, let's say you buy groceries and you pick up, I don't know, a bag of cereal that's in plastic, and the last person before you sneezed in that general vicinity, or they sneezed on their hand and they touched the bag but then put it back, or the cashier ringing it up, sneezed on their hand and then, as they touch your package, as they swipe it through the register. By the way, nothing but support for grocery cashiers. I've been one more than once. But anyway, the point is there's a lot of different avenues where some kind of, plastic coated surface can get some Omicron on it. The point is it's going to be on there for 8 days. So is it likely that you're going to attempt to use that food for eating purposes prior to 8 days? Yeah, it's pretty likely. So what do? Well, personally, taking this knowledge that 70% isopropyl alcohol in contact with the surface for 15 seconds will kill or render inactive the virus, I put down like a towel, large, like a beach towel, like a cheap towel. Just put down the groceries, and I put a spray cap on a bottle of 70% alcohol. You can use 90% or 91%, whether they sell. It just be aware that it's going to evaporate a little more quickly. All you need is 15 seconds, though. So anyway, but you put a spray thing there, put it down on the towel, just kind of hose everything off. Doesn't need to be like dripping, but that is going to cut down on the amount of virus on your surfaces. You'll let it dry there for a minute and then put it away. Personally, that's how I'd handle it. I mean, right now it's the winter. If you're in a colder place, which is most of the U.S., you'll be using gloves. You can avoid direct contact on skin, or if you're not using gloves, obviously use some sanitizer or alcohol on your hands. But, do try to cut down on it. I know at the beginning, everybody was like wiping down their groceries with Lysol back in spring 2020. And then everybody stopped because it's inconvenient and the CDC wasn't pushing people to do it. Well, this study should tell you otherwise. I mean, it's worth doing, in my opinion. Why get COVID? But that once you get into this train of thought, what else are you coming into contact with that other people did too? How about your mail? Some pieces of mail are going to have plastic surfaces on them. Plus, I mean, this study didn't test for paper, but if it can last for 8 days on plastic, I don't know, is 1 day on paper is that a reasonable assumption? I'd say probably. So, anyway, food for thought, do with it what you will. So let's now move on to the third and final article. This one I'm just going to do really briefly. This is a story from The Guardian. Exposure to one nasal droplet enough for COVID infection, says study. They did a challenge study, which is ethically questionable. Challenge studies is where they just take some substance that is being tested and they just directly give it to people. So in this study, they just directly gave people COVID and then monitored them at every stage of the infection. So the first time that this has been done, so it's significant. At a small sample size, just 36 people, but it was the first trial in which volunteers were given the virus and then monitored at every stage. The story is by Hannah Devlin, February 2nd, 2022. So yeah, it does conclude that exposure to a single nasal droplet is sufficient to become infected with COVID-19. And it's, I think, significant here, and kind of scratching my head a little bit about it. The study was carried out using a strain of the virus from before the emergence of Alpha, Delta, and Omicron variants. So I think that this gives us some useful information. It is another preprint, so has not been peer-reviewed yet. However, so my question here, like the stumbling point for me is, well, we know that there are some significant differences even between Delta and Omicron, like where it's most detectable and all that kind of stuff. So I think that these are interesting results, but are they totally applicable to current variants? That would be kind of my main study. Anyway, they're talking about this paving the way for future challenge studies that could help to accelerate the development of the next generation of vaccines and antiviral drugs. Anyway, the article is actually kind of thin beyond that, but they did do a study, monitored people at every stage. They did find, I think that this was the other significant thing, that, quote, the infection first appears in the throat and that the infectious virus peaks about 5 days into the infection, by which point the nose has a much higher viral load than the throat. So, that's at least applicable to the variant that they studied there. I think that, again, the findings there may be somewhat limited. I'm curious to see what happens on the other side of peer review with regard to things like that. But as far as the infectious virus peaking about 5 days into the infection, that's literally the CDC when they halved their guidance. They cut it in half from 10 to 5 days for isolation. Come on. So anyway, that's the COVID update. We are kind of in the lull. I did 13 videos in a row on Omicron when it was kind of on the way up and at the top. We're going to be watching this closely. I don't know when the next peak is going to be. It could be in 3 months. It could be in 3 weeks. I really don't know. There is another variant of Omicron. The first variant is BA.1. There is a BA.2 that has become dominant in a few European countries, including Denmark. It does appear to be more transmissible than Omicron. So Omicron was already about as transmissible as measles. The R0 number, R0, was 10 to 12. That's the number of people likely to become infected by one person who is infected. So basically it spreads at the rate of, 10 to 12 times, on each generation. So if we're multiplying that by 1.5, what do you get? You get 15 to 18 people infected per infected person. Not great, although we're still awaiting details on that. So like I said, I pretty much exhausted a lot of the major points I wanted to hit on COVID in those 13 videos of updates. I did have this to just sort of keep the topic alive a bit and keep it in people's minds fresh. From here, the next video that I'm going to put up is actually another reaction video. Russell Brand, the actor who's once involved with Katy Perry, apparently has a YouTube channel with like 5 million subscribers and pushing every kind of contrarian right-wing nonsense you can imagine. It is awful, and doing it with kind of like a new age veneer. Terrible stuff. Terrible, terrible, hokey, obvious grift type of stuff. But he is backing the Canadian Freedom Convoy 2022, the gang of uncouth truck drivers who are pissing everyone in Canada off as they drive their convoy through the frozen North Country in their quest to not be against the vaccine, but against the mandate. Oops, and incidentally, the 3 lead organizers have ties to far-right organizations, including the Sons of Odin, which is about as good as it sounds. Anyway, that's our next video. That is this video. What do you think? Leave any sincere and hopefully politely worded questions or comments below. I will do my best to answer them. I really appreciate the comments. It's often educational for me, and sometimes it leads to ideas for completely new videos that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. So thank you very much for those. I look forward to reading them. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Your support is really why there are so many videos on this channel, so please keep those coming. I really appreciate it. It's both encouraging and materially helpful. I can really use those, so thank you very much. If your name isn't on the screen yet and you'd like to get it up there, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. There's no commitment. You can sign up for just 1 month if you want, or be a sustaining member, and that really helps a lot, I gotta say. Otherwise, liking, sharing, subscribing, and leaving a comment, even if it is just good video or thanks, all that helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm and to expand the audience. The audience has been growing. We recently crossed 6,000 subscribers. We're now over 6,100. That's phenomenal. Thank you all for your participation in this community. It makes it just a better experience for everyone. Back in the real world, join an organization. We do at some point need to decide on what is going to be the actual party of the proletariat. In the meantime, we at a minimum need to build up all of the various working class institutions, labor unions, community unions, tenant unions, you name it. We need to build things back up again, mutual aid networks, solidarity networks, so that we can help each other out, resisting the, like I said, neoliberalism, fascism in slow motion, fascism on the installment plan. We do need to get organized. You know, online agitation and education are great, but unless we organize, it remains an abstraction, and we can't continue to just do things on that level. So look for orgs that are healthy, people get along with each other, are active, they're regularly doing things, and they have strong ties to the community. In other words, it's not just a bunch of people sitting in a room talking about stuff without sufficient real-world connections. Joining a good org can be a great experience and can give you experience in learning how to organize any project that you may start in the future. It's also a great place to meet other people and network. Even if the org is not perfect, even if there are ideological limitations, you can lay the groundwork now for doing something better 2 or 3 years from now. And you got to get out there and do something. At the same time, joining a bad org can be shattering, devastating, a really bad time. So do choose carefully. Again, if you contact an org and nobody's getting back to you after a month or two, I mean, that's really extreme, although it does happen. Really, if they get back to you within a couple of weeks, that's, I would say, about as long as I would give it personally. That's a good sign of an org that is, not struggling and or dysfunctional and or just doesn't really care about what it's doing. So anyway, choose wisely, but do choose. Anyway, that's it for now. Thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.